Welcome everybody. There's a couple of minutes to go before starting. My name's Blake Redding from Mapien, and looking forward to sharing the next hour with you on our first of the 3 webinar series. Very keen to get started on time because we're very mindful of everybody's time in the current environment. And I think a bit of a tech check, as we get started is that sense that I'm going to be hosting today's session, and I've got the webinar chat in front of me as well as the Q&A. So if you did have a question throughout the session, please do include it there, and we'll thread it through the session and keep a window of time towards the end so that we can make sure that questions can be answered. We've also got Alex Perret, one of our team who was instrumental in a lot of the data analysis and research that we've done behind the scenes for this webinar. He's tracking and recording a lot of the questions and answers and points that we're making throughout the session, so that we can produce a paper towards the end that really provides the key messages from the session. And so if there were any particular questions that we don't get to in the session or might come up afterwards, I'd encourage you to send them through, because that will help us populate that information in a way that's best going to help you. And sort of to kick off with the webinar series, the inspiration behind it is really about that sense of, as a business, we're passionate about people. And the way that COVID is affecting a lot of people is unfair. And to some degree, it's about how unfair is it impacting us. And so people's wellness is absolutely front of mind. And one of our sweet spots at Mapien is having diversity of thinking, from people on the psychology side through to heavy-end industrial relations, strategic HR, workforce planning. So what we want to try and bring together is our expertise, research, and the kindness of our clients in terms of sharing some of their experiences with us, so that we can all benefit and make the best possible decisions that we can make now that are going to have ripple effects into the future. So for positioning today's session, which is very much, I suppose, targeted towards businesses where working from home is a viable option, there's the conversation in terms of that we came across through a lot of the return to office planning about, we're thinking right now, what do we need to do to get people back to the office? And for some clients, we had to work quite hard to step back and think beyond return to office. Where is this going to take us? And so today's session is really about, for us, who might be business owners, senior leaders, HR professionals, perhaps even working in the real estate side or the business services side of the business. What are the types of options that we want to put forward to our business that are pragmatic, really take on board evidence, research pre and during COVID, so that you can be comfortable and confident in where you do land on that position. So I guess that's really the vision for the session. And towards the end, we want you to be able to say, well, this is what I'm taking away in terms of where there's a balance of evidence for, perhaps against, how that fits with my business. And then what are the key questions we need to be asking ourselves right now and strategically to, again, form that best decision moving forward. So I'm joined today by Lisa Paton, who's a psychologist specializing in culture transformation and executive coaching, amongst many other things as well, and Dr. Joshua Shingles, who brings tremendous experience from the hard edge industrial relations side of employee relations through to the strategic HR. And also we work together on graduate programs. So that balance of experience and thinking, we're really bringing to the table today to bring that sweet spot. So I suppose the first question that I'm going to throw to Lisa is very much inspired by the sense that we're seeing a lot of data, being thrown around at the moment, be it from, big four organizations, real estate organizations, then research businesses and engagement survey businesses, even ourselves, where we produced sort of some insights from 1,900 people, and that's getting over 2,000 now. So I guess with that data that's coming out now, Lisa, and we're thinking about the viability of working from home for our business moving forward, what's the data telling us?
So the data that we post, and I think it must be confusing for people, because I'm seeing headlines that are saying everybody loves working at home, they're productive. Everybody hates working at home, they're not productive. So it really is about, well, what is the data? I'll start off with what the data that we have collected. And as you said, Blake, it's now heading up over 2,000 people that we've actually surveyed with our wellbeing survey. And what we found, and this is across industries, public, private, for purpose, for-profit organisations, so a whole range of organisations. And what we found, we compared those that were working at home or remotely, and those that are working actually still stayed in the office. We found that people who worked from home had more energy, less stress, and worried less than those who were actually office or site-based. And I thought that was quite interesting. I would have expected the same. But then again, if we look at the context that we're working in, it's not surprising. So there's that fear base of COVID, am I going to get sick? So it kind of was a protective matter. But I just read an article the other night, which was everybody hates working from home. They're so not productive. So, and they had a nice sample size as well. So they had a really decent size. So it's not easy to say, or what do I do? Does everybody work from home? Do we stop working from home? And for me, it's not a one size fits all. We've got to look at the organisations and understand, well, what is right for us. One other thing that came out, which I thought was really interesting in the data, was that what I expected personally as a psychologist, seeing uncertainty is a really big trigger and emotional stressor for lots of us, because humans like certainty. But that wasn't the main stressor for people. It was actually the mental workload that actually came out quite strongly, that was a stressor for people. And so it's really interesting to look at the data. And I always think data that we collect is a point in time, and then we have to go and validate with people. And I think that's really important. So I went to one organisation who works with vulnerable children, and I said, when we were debriefing the wellness survey, and I said, your mental workload stress is quite high. And one of the senior practitioners said to me, well, it'll be interesting to see what it was they said, because the work that we do is incredibly mentally draining and stressful. And I thought, oh, wow. So I thought that was really interesting. So when we take the data, we have to actually validate it with the people that are around us. It's not a one size fits all. It truly is work finding out what's the best for our organisation. So for example, if you're going to work from home, does the role fit? Is that right? Have you got your systems and processes set up? So there's a whole range of things that we can explore. But the data's been quite interesting from my perspective that, working from home is actually working at the moment.
Thank you. And I think there is that element that, the way that the data that we're seeing come out now is a combination of a once-off questionnaire, some of those that might be tracked, over time. I guess the data point that we had was tracked over time and did sort of align with a sense of some peaks and troughs as key events did happen. And I sort of also agreed there, Lisa, where you mentioned there's most of the headlines that I see around blogs and on surveys is in overwhelming support for we're more productive, we're actually achieving more, there's less unplanned leave that's being taken. So you can be quite driven towards that sense of it's not worth asking why not, but it's actually how do we do it. So I think in terms of bringing some balance to those headlines is where I think, again, when we think about data that is produced and popularised, it sort of is driven by who completes the survey, and where Joshua's team works more in that side where, well, not all the time, but where there can be some challenges or issues that are emerging in teams and organizations. I'd be interested to throw it to yourself, Joshua, for a bit of a feedback in terms of what you and your team might have experienced, behaviorally, through the lens of when working from home sort of started to hit, from 23rd of March when Scott Morrison said, yep, if you can work from home, you should. Because this is the type of information that isn't making it into the wellbeing questionnaires.
Yeah, I appreciate what you're saying and those insights from Lisa in terms of it partially being reflective of something that could be temporal. We are in a unique situation. So in answer to your question, we first have to think about whether we actually are in a position to confidently talk to what might be some of the ill effects emerging from this period where work from home has been rolled out so comprehensively, whole parts of workforces and whole workforces in ways that we wouldn't have seen in the past because it's come from the external influence of government restrictions. Certainly, when you're looking at survey data, they can miss things. There are other variables involved. So when I'm listening to what we've found through our survey, the variables there speak to employee experience. It's perfectly valid to ask people about what their experiences have been and for them to reflect on that. There can be other risks involved in managing that workforce or other conflict that takes some time to surface. I recall a Harvard Business Review article some time ago talking about how at a parcel service, they had received some amazing results in terms of staff morale. Job satisfaction was seen as very high, and yet 6 to 12 months later, they had some of the most costly strike action they'd ever had because the survey failed to uncover conflict that was around the perceptions of the proliferation of part-time work throughout that workforce, and it wasn't picked up through asking people about their general level of satisfaction. And of course, employees are conscious about how the information that they're providing is going to be used, that those results will influence what their future workplace experience might be. So if they've become attached to working from home, we have to understand that those biases might have a part to play in the way that self-report data is skewed towards the positive aspects of that work. In terms of our exposure in the team that I work in, we deal with a lot of conflict and grievances. So what I would say is that to date, the behaviours that we're dealing with, the allegations that we're looking into, the conflict that we're seeking to mediate and resolve is ostensibly unchanged. It's the same issues and challenges that I've seen for the last 15 years working in this field. What I would say is that some of those behaviours will be borne out in different ways in the virtual environment. Maybe there will be different forms of inappropriate conduct that will be able to be exhibited through that process, but we're not going to know about that for quite some time. Using complaints that have been made as a lag indicator. We would expect to see what kind of conflict and dysfunction has arisen during this time in the months to come. It's not something that we can assess at this point.
Excellent. Great. And I think in terms of the key part that stood out for myself is that in comparison to survey data that's being publicised to be saying we're much better off, working from home. And when we're looking at some of those hard indicators of HR performance about grievances, the level to which they're substantiated, health claims, working from home, I think that arise from work from home, it's been quite stable, not too much change. I think that's an important, story to look at, in that a lot of the surveys aren't looking, for stability. We're looking for differences. And so I think we're one of the items where have the luxury to sort of work with clients making these decisions, and so we work with a behavioural economist, Isaac Baker, who is always helpful in terms of helping with framing of questions and thinking about the ways of work. And on some of the panels, I think what's really helpful from a dynamic perspective is that the decision makers and the influencers don't make it clear in terms of their preference, in terms of for or against working from home, to reduce this groupthink. So we don't try and join the bandwagon of, yep, we've got to do it, or no, we shouldn't do it. And so I guess this sort of raises the questions around that sense of, well, if we look at it a different way, what is it that we might lose, by working, by not working from home? And the other one that's probably more commonly coming up, and it sort of comes through from your point, Joshua, about the complaints that we're receiving now is essentially there's time, before we see them result in issues. So it's quite a viable, or appropriate response to say the data that we're getting now, isn't likely to be a valid indicator, to inform decisions, for us into the future. It's unlikely that we're going to have forced isolation, for the next 5 to 10 years. It's unlikely, that people aren't going to be able to travel and take holidays for the next 5 to 10 years. Humans will adapt and change, and we're going to find ourselves, and we are now, where returning to the office is producing this hybrid experience, where we're starting to experience a difference of, massive difference between everyone's at home, if they can work from home, versus now it's quite splintered and hybrid. So with that in mind, this is where the question comes onto the table to say, well, let's look at the research, the data, the evidence, the intelligence that we had pre-COVID. Is that going to be a more valid predictor, of some of the working from home decisions, that we should be making? And I'd sort of throw again to Lisa to sort of kick off, I guess, round two of the question.
Thank you, Blake. I don't think there's been that much of a change, to be honest. I think I've heard for a long time that people want to change, want to work from home and work, or I keep saying home, but work remotely, work flexibly. So there's pluses and minuses for everything. And I think what the data has told us is there's some core elements that will sit there that are the right criteria that you need to keep in mind to make this successful. And so it's always been, I think this has been coming to the fore for me in particular at the moment, is choice. So having people have a choice to work from home, if they can, that's fantastic. But we've got to make sure that the role is right for working from home. And we were talking about this the other day, and the example I used was having a bus driver. A bus driver is not suitable at the moment because we don't have, or we do have some buses that can drive themselves. So truck drivers, long distance drivers, things like that, at the moment is not suitable for remote working. So it's just, and I know that's a very simplistic and a very obtuse example of actually, we've got to look at where we can work from home and when we can't. But there absolutely is benefits from working from home, and so we had higher motivation, higher quality of work. We've got some really good things that if I've got a choice, and that empowers people, so I'm feeling more satisfied, more engaged. It's the suitability of the role and whether they can work from home. And we've got to have the planned response. So if you think about when COVID first hit, we were all sitting around working about how the hell are we going to get work chairs home? How are we setting up our home offices? So it's a really pragmatic moment. And we're in that now, in that space. So making sure that we've got good systems, processes, resources for people to be set up, and how do we maintain this? So we've got to operate differently. But it's been there the whole time. I think the inhibitor has been quite often, and what I hear is when I work with frontline, people at frontline saying, I want to work, I'm better at home, but my manager doesn't allow it. But the organisation doesn't allow it, despite having policies and process and having the rhetoric that I support this. People found that as a barrier. Well, now that's been taken away. And I think there's pluses and minuses to both, but it's how do we set people up for success? And it's same. Pre-COVID, post-COVID, I think it's the same. It's just that we were forced to make it happen. Does that answer your question?
Well, I think where you mentioned, we're in this period of transition now, so perhaps pre-COVID, although it might have been viable, for more working from home, there were easy reasons, convenient reasons that made it normal, for it not to be as prevalent, so figures to the effect of 5 to 10% of a work from home workforce. Now, businesses edging towards that sort of 85%, 60 to 85%. So what was seen to be challenging and really difficult to actually achieve, there's now visible evidence that, hey, we can actually do it. I've now got that accounting software on my computer at home. And even though it's highly confidential data, we've done it over the past 5 months without a breach. So we're sort of creating this new, I guess, set of standards. And so with that sort of in mind, and I think this is where it sort of comes a bit to a double-barreled question for Joshua in terms of, from your sort of side of work where can be a bit more focused on the risk. I understand that pre-COVID there was, I guess, a level to which some cases, say in Telstra, where somebody injured themselves at home, kind of probably had a disproportionate impact on people's decisions about the safety of working from home or not. And then sort of double barreling that one for you with Lisa's around that sense of, now it's getting a bit distorted. Bus driver, it's pretty clear. If you drive that bus, you can't work from home. You're an office worker and your manager prefers you working in the office, regardless of how more or less effective you are. This starts to hit to the core of a lot of, I guess, those grievances that we face, or those early indicators we see in culture, which is about unfairness. So unfairness has been the core, to a lot of challenges, particularly if that unfairness is perceived over time, it starts to affect people's judgment and perception. So with that in mind, Joshua, that's where it's like last 5 months, data's still emerging to a level that we can use it reliably, to inform what we could be doing. Lisa's point, it's given us a great indicator, a realistic job preview of what it could look like. So Joshua, from your perspective, looking further back at that more sort of evidence thinking culture performance, how do you see working from home, decision making helped by that?
Okay, so
long question ever.
I'll try to keep the answer shorter than the question. The part that you've mentioned in relation to the Telstra decision, that wasn't the only decision, but certainly one that gained a lot of prominence about a decade ago. And it was an eye-opener, which did lead to a lot of conservatism in terms of how we manage working from home, but also the exposure of some real genuine risks that are undeniable for employers in that space. So that was a situation where an individual injured a shoulder, not while actually sitting in their home office space, but actually while they were going to get cough mixture, I think from the kitchen, and then injured their shoulder again in a separate incident when they were going to the front door. And locking that front door was actually a directive of the employer because there'd been a number of break-ins in that area. And so in that particular case, what was so picked up in terms of a highlighted aspect to it was the fact that these were aspects of working from home where it was found that if an injury occurred, that would still be compensable. Now, in terms of work health and safety requirements, that doesn't just extend to your own employer's premises. That's where the work is performed. And so the duty of care to ensure that someone is safe extends to where someone is working in the home environment. In workers' compensation, it also extends to injuries that can occur home if it was arising out of or in the course of work. And so I think what was significant in relation to that case and similar cases like it was that there is so little control and so little surveillance of that home environment. And yet, whether there was negligence on the part of any individual, whether they had not set their home up effectively, does not cause the injury to not be compensable. So it was significant in terms of employer liability. You might take certain steps to ensure that at a point in time that home environment is safe in the office, but it's what arrays around the office and what might change in the office. It might be fine on one day, but then they move the equipment and things around. So that lack of control and the lack of passive surveillance that we otherwise might have in the workplace to see if someone's engaging in an act that might be unsafe. Because we've now been in an experience where we've had large parts of the workforce forced to work from home as a viable means of trying to maintain a level of productivity during this period of time, I think it has meant that we've tested some of the prejudices and the assumptions that have been made around working from home. It's always been the case that someone in certain circumstances under the Act might make a request for flexible working arrangements. It's always been the case that there might be considerations in terms of who can and who can't work from home. And they've been based, if there can be objective and defendable, on the actual requirements of the position and the operational needs of the workplace. And what we've actually seen is an opportunity to test whether some of those things are accurate or not. And I do see that that's going to have implications when those questions come up in the future around why is person X able to work from home and person Y cannot? Or why is person Y able to make greater choices and have greater autonomy about the location or timing of their work while another person can't? And it's important to have some objective criteria based on the nature of the work in order to make those decisions and for them to be defendable.
And on that one, Joshua, I think what this sort of new experience is showing is that, pre-COVID, this sort of source of unfairness, that could arise is where one of the risks of working from home was if it's not part of your culture, if your leader isn't well across the technology in terms of how to include you, and actually aware of the way by which we can help you manage your career, people working from home, can be more likely to miss out on good work, and miss out on promotions. And that brought a risk to their productivity and mental health. Now we're kind of going to see this risk sort of mirrored, in the workplace where there might be people who are doing good work, on their ambitious career progression cycle and feeling like, I'm going to miss out if I don't get to work from home. And I suppose there's that sort of the I guess the factor of fairness, is is going to be, I guess, an area of challenge, that we've never quite experienced before. And I think from a culture perspective, Lisa, I guess in some of the experiences that you might be working with and some of the coaching sort of conversations that you're having, what are the types of challenges, or I guess where fairness is a factor, that it's starting to come out?
And you're absolutely spot on. It's about access to people. As a leader, you're a resource. People want to spend the time with you. You can actually give out the good work. It's those corridor conversations. So there is absolutely perceptions of fairness, or I'm not being treated the same. The challenge is, as soon as we have this, at the moment, this is what we're looking at. The research is saying that, or what people are telling us, let's say that, but people are telling us they kind of want to work from home 2 to 3 days a week. That's kind of their ideal at the moment, and being in the office those other days. And we've got people coming back into the office. We've got our green and blue teams and things like that are week on, week off. As soon as we do that kind of stuff, we've got the hybrid model, and therefore we've got in groups and out groups. So it's about how do we manage that. And people are saying to me, it's like, well, I'm missing my corridor conversations, but X is having them. People are making decisions about my work. I'm the leader, and I've now got 3 days worth of work. I didn't decide that. So all these kinds of things are coming to the fore for people. But for me, and you're right, I think what isn't happening at the moment for a number of organizations, some are there, but we're putting the culture aside. We're not proactively managing what we want in our culture. So when we're getting perceptions of fairness and inequity, it's our processes. It's like, and I was coaching a gentleman the other day. It was fabulous. And he said to me, Lisa, it's been really interesting. We've got people working from home. So what we've done is we've put the person who's working from home so that we don't forget them, because it's very automated, out of sight, out of mind. We get whoever's working from home to rotate and actually facilitate the team meetings, so that they're always front and center and they're not missing out on communications. So there's different strategies we can apply to the problems. And what I'm hearing from people at this stage is a problem focus. It's like, I'm not having my corridor conversations. And I was working with a leader who said she was just given feedback from her 2IC that people were saying, they're not seeing you. I'm not seeing you. And so she's like, well, what can I do? I can't be everywhere. And so it's like, well, what can we do? So what we strategized was she would go into their morning muster and just rotate around the teams. So it's about, where are we moving to the problem, to the solution focus? And the challenge for me is when we're saying that fairness is being a trigger. And for those who know the David Rock SCARF model, I'm happy to share that after if anyone's not across it or would like more information. Fairness is a huge factor in what can trigger emotional responses in organisations. But it doesn't mean that my perception that it's not fair makes it the reality. So we've got to be having really critical conversations during this time to explore what is a person seeing that makes it right. So from Joshua's lens, you'd be encouraging having good processes and policies in place to make it explicit what we're doing. I'm saying from that, yes, foundation, absolutely. Next part, leaders having conversations. And if there is something that's occurring that is unfair, how are you managing it? You need to fix it. If it's not, then we've got to redress the way the person's thinking about it. There was I talk a lot, but there was a really interesting article that I saw the other day, and it said that people if everybody's working from home, we're all well aligned. If everybody's working in the office, we're all well aligned to our culture. We're feeling engaged. It's when we get the hybrid model where people are feeling disconnected to the culture of the organisation. And this is something we'll pick up in next week, or the next webinar we have. But I think it's like, what are we doing about that? How are we proactively managing it, not just being reactive and responding?
That kind of nails a little bit to the vision behind the webinar series, to help be making decisions now that can start to have the right ripple effects. Because I think listening to your piece there too, Lisa, is about some of the challenges. And so I've got some research in front of me that speaks to the productivity and mental health risks and benefits of working from home pre-COVID. Yeah. If we look at those, the risks were often, because the outcomes for people are actually contradictory. People working from home can experience greater engagement, satisfaction, and performance. People who don't get to can as well. There's a mediator in there largely around, how my employee experience is managed. And so there's sort of the risks, for working from home where I am disconnected from my team. I'm not being included, in the communication. I'm being overlooked. I'm actually not tech savvy enough to actually take advantage of the systems and processes that are in place to help my employee experience be better. If those are experienced, I'm more likely to encounter reduced productivity and challenges to my mental health. So that was pre-COVID data. It's almost as if those challenges are now being brought to our people who are working in the office, because there's a high proportion of people who are now connecting remotely or virtually, which means all of us, need to be more across the digital literacy. And we're sort of moving into, I guess, some of the strategies that we would need to be putting forward to make it work. And so that, just to sort of hover on the research pre-COVID for a moment, was, and it's quite like, I'd say unchanged based on any evidence or data that's being produced yet, is that sense of, and you use the word choice, Lisa, where there's an element of choice in the degree to which I am working from home or not. And so you kind of have that conversation, and the productivity and mental health benefits are more likely to be experienced where people are working at about 20% from home. So the hybrid option, pre-COVID appeared to be the right way to go, as opposed to the all or nothing. The other aspect too we talk about is suitability of the role, to actually enable working from home effectively. And the other aspect is about its blend. There's actually measures that have been taken before, during that employee experience that is keeping the technology running so that people are connected, keeping people included in the communication. I guess the other piece around being that loss of connection or identity with the team is also not dissimilar to those people who might be working part-time. So research into, say, one's psychological contract or commitment to an organisation, can be lower when we're working part-time. Largely believed to be because when I'm working part-time, I've got more time for other things. So I've actually got more identities or connections in my life that I'm using to define, where I'm happy and I'm satisfied. So I'm not as reliant on work. So I guess that's sort of moving into the third round of questioning. So if we sort of looked at the what are we seeing in the data during COVID, we're kind of seeing, hey, people are tracking pretty well, and we're not actually seeing an improvement or a worsening, in some of the IR experiences that we're having. They're just still coming out in different ways. So jury's out. Second round, let's look at pre-COVID. I'm kind of sensing there's opportunity. We haven't talked too much about the opportunity, probably more around the risk, that's probably increasing with more working from home due to those risks that people experienced working from home are now being brought into the office with a hybrid experience, which sort of starts to highlight the importance of saying, if there's a choice, for us, because it's important to our employer brand, it connects with our values, it's part of what we would sort of look to say culturally, this is what we do. It does reflect flexibility. It does reflect innovation. So it's kind of where if we start to experience a narrative in our culture where not letting people work from home or not letting, this thing being inclusive in that respect, it could do more damage than harm. It's going to force us into the complexity of hybrid work, and this is where it's sort of getting into that space of we're also going to be under pressure from our people in real estate who are looking at lease terms, for 5 to 10 years. Do we have to incur the cost of people having an office at home and an office in the workplace, or are we going to actually be a little bit of both, but not replicating? So that we're going to be coming up against those types of questions and challenges. So this is moving into that round 3, of the question, is that sense of we put together our experience through COVID, we put that with the experience pre-COVID, and we started to step into that consultant mode to say, okay, what are the important sort of questions that we'd be asking our clients right now to help them, decide if working from home at a higher proportion is the right direction to go. You know? And be that the case, how do you make it work? You know? And so I'll sort of mix it up a bit and throw to Joshua in the first instance, in terms of that sense of when you're in that zone where we're now more future focused, in terms of if you've made the choice to lift, you know, the proportion of working from home, here's what you really need to be doing to make it work.
Okay. Yeah, well, I think you've hit on some very valuable points there as we now move into the phase of people being asked to return to the work or to return to work more often, in terms of coming to a particular building or a particular location and to spend a certain portion of their week there. With the commute time that's involved with that, we would expect to see that there'll be some frustration or some agitation potentially because of a lack of control if that becomes a directive or a requirement, because an organisation or part of an organisation has decided that's the best thing in terms of a productivity outcome, to see that work performed in that particular way, which they can determine. But a number of the solutions that we've been talking about are also beneficial to deal with that sense of perceived injustice or unfairness that might arise in those circumstances. Because if moving forward, we can, if we haven't already, more clearly define how we will determine working from home arrangements and how we will operationalize working from home arrangements to deal with risks and concerns, then that becomes the go-to in terms of a consistent standard. What is the objective criteria that we'll use to determine which positions are ones that can continue to be performed on an ostensibly home-based work or remote work, and which ones require a certain period of time in the office, and to try and think about those things objectively so that when we go to communicate those decisions, or we do have to have a difficult conversation where the needs of a particular role are somewhat unmatched to the desires of the person performing that role, we had that basis to go to say, well, actually in the circumstances, this is not going to be workable. And in terms of what might not be workable, that can be about the safety of the person, that can be about their ability to communicate, or for them to be able to demonstrate and pass on elements of the workflow that they're responsible for. A number of considerations that becomes more objective than what the employee might perceive as going on. Left in a vacuum without communication around how we make these choices, they might think it's about favoritism, or it's because I'm being passed over because of some past conversation, or because I tried to challenge my leader about how we do things. All of these alternative agendas might be considered the reason why those choices are being made. And to the extent that we can talk transparently around how we're making those choices and decisions, I think that it takes some of the heat out of those conversations, and certainly we can argue was reasonable management action in the circumstances. So in terms of moving forward with the implementation of these arrangements, that's what I'm talking to clients about, is what is the basis upon which you're making these choices and decisions? How best can we manage those arrangements when they are working out of the home? And it's not about completely avoiding any risk of something going wrong. As always, just like if people are working in the office, it's about mitigating those risks.
Gotcha. And I think I love that sort of element of what's the objective criteria, you know, that we're using, you know, to decide if a role and person is viable or suitable for working from home, you know, which kind of feels like one of those elements where, you know, we've seen it where sometimes people might say, we want innovation to be part of our culture. You know, it's this sort of sense of it's sexy, it's where we're drawn to. And then it's like innovation. If you want to commit to innovation, we've got to be prepared for people to challenge you. You've got to be comfortable with conflict. You've got to be comfortable with people starting at different times, finishing at different times, making more mistakes, you know, and liking less rules. So if this is probably a bit of a similar experience for me in that sense of saying, okay, if we're seeing working from home as a valuable plug into our culture, you know, and our employee experience, you know, we've got to be in for the ride and do it well, you know, because it's going to create, I guess, more moments of truth, you know, as to whether or not we can actually deliver on our employer brand promise, you know, and achieve higher performance than we ever had before in the toughest economy any of us have ever lived through, and it's probably going to endure for the next 10 to 20 years. And so I think with that in mind, I guess, Lisa, from your perspective, where we might have a consistent level of criteria to what creates this sense of suitability for a role, we can, we're co-creating them with clients right now, and we're getting the question about how do we roll this out consistently. This is where I'm sort of going in this sort of frame of, righto, work from home, we decide we want more of it, let's get that sort of clarity, behind our decisions early. We'll test it, we can adapt it, we'll adjust it as we learn, start there. Then, similar to when we're going through a restructure or a merger, then we've got to arm our leaders with what they need to make it work. So Lisa, in that space, where do you sort of see the important decision points, advice coming through?
But can I just go back just a little step? I just want to say that what Joshua talked about is having that really objective, transparent policies, communications, the way people get to decisions is fundamental in cultures that thrive. And I love the fact that it's all those stories that people tell themselves around, it's because, for example, Blake doesn't like me, so I didn't get the opportunity to work on that piece of work. Where in actual fact, it's like, well, there's that criteria. So if you share that, you're lessening the conflict. If I say that, and I loved, again, Joshua, I think you just took a lot of what I was going to say out of my words out of my mouth, so thank you, is that, I love that we never eliminate risk. We know this. We have to mitigate it. And if we look at what the research is telling us, and yes, I agree, 5 months, 6 months, it's not long enough to really go, this is, we can hang our hat on this is best practice. But we can say what the research has shown with the right conditions, such as the right job working remotely, the right person, job fit, all that kind of stuff, this working from home or working remotely works. The benefits from my perspective can outweigh the risks. We do, and I love that Telstra example that you had before, and how that risk aversion that we get, where it's like, well, we have accidents in the workplace. Mining companies, for example, spend an absolute fortune trying to eliminate, injury in the workplace. So, we have these risks, and whether we have it there because, and you can see me, brilliant. That's an easier way, rather than actually let's engage the adults that work in our workplace and set the right conditions and criteria. So I guess if we're going to be leading forward in this, my advice, and where I'm working with people at the moment, is invest in your leaders. Have the conversations. Your leaders are the ones that are going to take this forward for you. So keep investing in your leaders. And I remember a long time when I was first at uni, many years ago, I remember them saying to me, one of the challenges that a lot of organizations do is when times get hard, they withdraw money from marketing and marketing activities. And in actual fact, if you objectively think about that, that's the worst decision you can make. You need to be investing in a downward market with your team. At the moment, what I've seen, and I'm a bit worried about it, is there's a lack of investment in leaders. And I'm going to say, keep, whatever it looks like in your form, keep investing in your leaders. Make sure they've got the skills to be having these conversations that actually, Blake, it's not because, I favour X, Y, Z, it's because of this criteria, having those conversations and being able to support people through it. I think that's a really important thing. So having your really clear objectives, KPIs. What are my expectations? What does working from home actually look like? What are my expectations? Is it okay that I take a walk with the dog? So keep developing your people. So as a leader, how are you investing in your people? Nothing's changed. We've actually in more of a crisis mode, so we need to keep investing in those people. Look at what your culture is, define what the next steps are.
And I'm just going to jump in because we've had a ripper question come through, which kind of tests us both. So I think, we're saying, how does it fit with your culture? If so, that warrants the investment to go further. We've got one of these scenarios, which is why our leaders, HR, need to be prepared for this, is that we're talking about clear, transparent criteria to decide if the role and person is suitable for working from home. I've got a team, organizational psychologists. One person, my criteria goes, yep, you can work from home. The other person, that doesn't meet my criteria. That's going to sort of, largely due to the sense of trust I've got for that person. So I'm not sure who to go to first for this one. I'm going to go to Joshua, because just to keep mixing and say, in that case, Joshua, what's the advice, and does the valid criteria, help you in this forum, and if so, how?
Yeah, and thank you so much, Sharon, for the question. That's fantastic for us to be able to have the opportunity to talk about this. I think you're probably speaking for many in asking this question. My choices as a manager around who I'm going to be supportive of for working from home and who I don't, with my immediate reaction on whether I trust that person to continue to perform the work. And in fact, it's part of a give and take relationship. If I have individuals that I know will get that work done and I don't need to keep looking over their shoulder in the workplace, well, it would be the same as working from home. And if that's a benefit, I'd like to extend that to them. So I can understand that perspective. I would want to disentangle here the ability to manage workflow and to test whether performance is occurring at a high level and the contribution to the organisation as being one part of this. Can I trust that the work will be done? Because there's some forms of work where it can be quite obvious and we can actually observe whether the work is being performed in an appropriate manner. And there are others where it's a bit more amorphous and it might be challenging. So that's more about the system and the process. The other element is behavioural. The relationship that the manager and the employee have formed over a period of time will be one of trust or one of low trust based on the experience that they've had. One of the challenges with using trust as the basis of the criteria will be if these are private, subjective perceptions of a manager. So for an individual to say to their manager, how come that person's been able to continue to working from home and I can't? Without any history of there being some form of performance counselling or some performance improvement process, or even a conversation to say, as part of the constructive feedback, you need to be working on these areas, I'm not receiving the work from you on time, and that comes out of the blue, that I can see as being problematic. To say to that one individual, well, it's because I don't trust you because of this previous experience, and for that to be completely unknown to the employee, well, we can expect that my team might be getting a complaint further on down the track that raises a whole range of objections about how they've been managed and treated and the opportunities they've missed out on because of the way that they've been managed. I'm not saying that those would necessarily be justified, but I'm always thinking about the next step. If we make a decision, it sounds on the surface, yes, of course, make your decisions based on trust, but I think we need to work a little bit more hard on how we're going to make those choices. And is that a system process issue? Is that a role issue? Or is this actually a behavioural matter that has or has not been addressed in the past that we need to look at?
And I think, Joshua, you used the term passive surveillance earlier, which can sometimes be a true or untrue management mechanism, for getting people to do what you think they need to be doing. And so I think where this one, for me sounds like if there's somebody with a pre-existing performance challenge, it's being recorded and it's being managed, that may or may not be on your criteria, and make that conversation not easier, but more consistent and predictable and transparent. It's where these criteria and shift that we're making is going to create these decision points and perhaps create the need for conversations to be happening that we've always needed to have, but we haven't quite gotten to the core of the issue. And this speaks to the culture, and I guess the prevalence of those will influence the impact, the cost, the time, to effectively manage this transition to work from home. And I think that's where, I guess, Lisa, from your culture, and difficult conversations background and perspective, what sort of support, I guess, or response might you provide Sharon, in that scenario?
I thank Sharon for the question. I think it's absolutely brilliant. And we've actually had a similar conversation just recently around this, because it's about everybody it's a fairness thing, it's about who can work from home, but it's got to be on performance. It's got to be based on, do you actually perform? And I think, I guess the question, the comments that that were made is around making sure the criteria is objective and it's no left of centre. So where I work with people at the moment, when there's a performance issue, I'm doing a lot of what I call partnership coaching. So because when we go in as a coach, I'm there to support the development of that person. But when there's a specific performance criteria and behavioural change that a leader's looking for, I get the leader and the person in the room together, and then we identify what the challenges are so that we can start unpacking, and we help develop the person to change that behaviour. So I think I come from a place of development. Why isn't a person performing? Let's look at what the root cause of that is, and then how do we support the person to develop? We've done that, we've invested in them, then there's other consequences and different conversations that we have. I think that communication is critical, and how we do it and how we say it. And actually, if it's okay if I use this example, Blake, during this COVID environment, during working from home, Blake sent me an email. It was a really quick email, and I was like, oh, the tone, it shocked me. So I just reached out to Blake, because I've got psychological safety, so I can say, oh, is everything okay? Have I done something? Or are you just really busy? And he said, oh, Lisa, I'm sorry, I didn't mean anything by it. I was busy. The challenges are people having those conversations and resentments coming up. So how we have our conversations, communicating is critical. Giving people, I went off tangent there a little bit, but coming back to Sharon's comment around, we've just got to be having the conversations, understanding why a person isn't performing. And you're right, it's a privilege to work from home. It's not a right, but it's got to be objective, and people have got to know why they can and why they can't.
Excellent. And Sharon did have a follow-up question around tips for managing performance remotely. Now, there's probably two sides to this one, and I think that's where one is about, we've got some tips that we can include in the FAQs about managing teams remotely. I guess, Joshua, from your perspective, in terms of where you're front and center in probably managing the hard side of performance management when people are remote, what advice do you have?
And this has obviously been more obviously exposed in the current environment, but I think is an ongoing and important challenge that we can't shy away from as leaders, as to what high performance actually looks like. And the question here is particularly, how do you manage that remotely? I just want to initially say, this is not just about dealing with underperformance, because a high performer, whilst they might also be trusted to perform well, wants to know that that will be recognized. So wherever we move forward, whenever we take strides forward in how we can assess whether someone working remotely is performing at an unacceptable, adequate, or above and beyond what the requirements would be, that's valuable for the whole culture, the whole workforce, not just the individuals who are being managed because their performance needs to lift to hit some standard. So to any extent that we can improve how we can define that performance, the better. To come to the question, this is going to be difficult in this forum, because it so needs to be customized to the particular role and the nature of the workflow as to how we might manage the performance remotely. How do we see if the outcomes are there? What are our measures? That can be how we track one individual's contribution to a particular project and the success of that project. That can be how we, the frequency with which we check in and see what progress is being made in terms of the person's tasks and performance. That can be ways in which we assess quality by going to the end customer and talking about their experiences and getting that feedback. These are all the same sorts of questions that we would have whether the person was working from home, from the office, on a client site, or anywhere else. And they're not easy. They're hard. They're challenging. And our methods have to, I suppose, be more robust. And we can't just rely on the passive surveillance. But I'm not sure that the passive surveillance was that great before anyway. Physical presence in a particular location has always been a very, very poor metric of productivity. Just because I have a body in a room does not mean they are contributing effectively to an organization. But we run to these areas that are more measurable because they're measurable, not necessarily because they're a good indicator of the outcomes and the productivity that we're getting out of a particular role. So that's kind of a partial answer, but not a full answer to the question, because I think it's an important question, but one that's not easily answered on a generalized basis.
And I think the other, and I guess there's tips that Joshua would probably sort of nail in the moment on the case. And I think one of the sort of, some of the intel that we want to leak, through the post-webinar information is some of the, I guess, the skills that we've identified as being required, for employees working from home, and then also managers of employees working from home. And they could be both, but they are quite different. One of those core skills is about proactive performance management. So if you work in sales or call centers, it can be quite easy to articulate KPIs, and measurable outcomes. And when you move into an environment where performance can be hard to actually measure in an output perspective, put on top of that the most challenging economy we've ever been in, and almost people doubling that level of mental health challenge, there's going to be a dip in performance. So this proactive performance management skill in leaders, is going to lift to the surface that sense of, and it came out in our well-being survey with the single biggest thing that a leader can do is to provide me with more feedback on my task performance. There seems to be a sense that whether it be guilt or time, managers not sort of providing task feedback in a group setting. And when I've got you one-on-one, I'm checking in terms of how you're going. If I don't like you or you're not performing, I'm probably not having those one-on-one check-ins as much because it's uncomfortable. So this is where it's the skill and the expectation, and perhaps whether that's a KPI or outcome for managers in terms of that, the task check-ins that we're having on a consistent basis. Because high achievers love them, and are high maintenance and want to know how well they're performing. Underperformers are very happy with as little feedback as possible. And they do take a disproportionate impact of time. And I guess what's going to happen as we relax the national requirements around working from home is that there's going to be a cluster of, and not a majority, but where it is more important to be having the performance conversations, the expectations, and it's probably going to actually lift most of their performance and then give the chance or the window of opportunity to move into, I guess, where we do need some stronger, I guess, performance management action taken, which may or may not require people to return in the office to adequately participate in that performance improvement plan, or process. So I think that's sort of like a mini impact assessment where we're kind of saying culturally, economically, working from home is the right step to have if we've got really clear criteria, for its suitability. If we're not losing more time, and culture currency by lifting this sort of vigilance around performance goal setting and performance evaluation. Now that's probably going to be a costly behavior shift that would return dividends, in the longer term. And the types of skills that we're seeing as critical is the digital literacy, both for the worker and the manager, so they can be inclusive, and enable it to happen as efficiently as it would do in the office. Self-coaching, if I'm actually the person working from home, so that I can coach myself through obstacles. Coaching, if I'm the leader, to be having conversations about tasks and getting people through. That emotional intelligence is global, but it taps into that. Are you resilient? Resilient enough to be dealing with problems on the spot that pop up when you don't have a team to ask, or a team to work with. And for a leader to be recognizing emotional challenges in their followers, whether you don't have as much face time or incidental communication from those around you. When I'm working from home, it's about influential communication. So I'm speaking up, when I'm uncomfortable or missing out or not getting enough clarity. As a leader, it is that proactive performance management. If I'm working from home, it's the ergonomics. I've got to be skilled in that because I can't rely on people to be making sure that my desk height and chair is all perfect all the time. And I'm not looking down at my laptop all the time. That's a skill we should expect from our people. From a leader too, it's about task and workflow management. So it's that sense of, if we liked being in the office and people bouncing off each other, that's going to be harder, to support in working from home. Or maybe not even harder, but a bit different in how it looks. And then performance and goal setting, which is probably the prelude to performance management. So I think it's that probably trying to provide that information to help contribute to that decision about, do we go and lift this work from home proportion? Does it have financial and cultural benefits for us as a business? And which should incorporate that wellness focus for us. If so, these are the steps that we're going to have to invest in. You know, it's not going to happen itself. And I hope that's sort of some information that we've tried to put on the table for you this morning to try and help with that decision making. And I think that's where, you know, Alex is capturing some of the conversation so that we can form this into a bit more of a structured document that might help you do an impact assessment, identify the steps that we really need to take to enable it to work for us and our people, you know, because looking at the data and the research, you know, the productivity and mental health benefits that can be achieved through the right capability and the viability and the support, you know, is actually a very powerful and supported economic decision, you know. But as we've all mentioned, it's not a one size fits all, and we all should go all in. So we've hit 12 p.m. on the mark. Appreciate the questions that have come through. Thank you to Joshua and Lisa, you know, for a no holds barred window into your experience and expertise, and look forward to keeping in touch. Our next session is very much focused on the team culture aspect. Now, this is going to really focus on, I guess, Sharon's question around performance management. You know, there's stuff that's happening at a team culture level now that's shifting that we need to take into account. So it's not all about performance management, but I've taken that question with notice to make sure that it's plugged into the next one about that performance culture, you know, as part of a team. And I guess appreciating that when we didn't all work from home, a hero leader would usually have a disproportionate impact on your team's performance. In the new sort of space we're going to find that it's the team performance and culture that's going to have the proportional impact on performance. So how are teams making it happen, and what are the thoughts we make? So thanks, team. Awesome to steal your attention today.